It's 5 o'clock in London, it's midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, and 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID Livestream, Series 26, Episode 3 in the aggregate, that's episode number 153, starts here. Well, what a wonderful way to start the week, ladies and gentlemen. A bell ringing at the New York Stock Exchange for Javier Milei. I see John Hulsman today talking about how the Milei revolution is working. And indeed, also good news for NASDAQ. BIMA, the amalgamated exchange in Argentina, have just ordered a wonderful spiffing new license for clearing technology. Let's hope BIMA can profit off the back of Javier Milei's attempts to put together again an economy which was just fabulous all the way back in about 1946, but has been having a bit of a tricky time of it ever since. Excellent news with that NASDAQ license. Meanwhile, the SEC, they've been busy. A unanimous decision by the commissioners of the Securities and Exchange Commission of the USA, changing the tick sizes once again. We've now got a more competitive environment than ever. One of the people very, very excited about that, of course, was bringing forward greater competition at all points in time. The chief flash boy himself, Brad Katsuyama, and what a week they had, ladies and gentlemen. IEX is entering the options market. It all becomes clearer now. Why were they employing all those brilliant minds who'd previously been involved with places like SIBO and BATS? Of course, it was so that IEX can themselves become the 19th exchange in the buoyant US stock options market. All the very best to them. And once again, the message carried over from last week's show is liquidity begets liquidity. Speaking of liquidity, welcome FMX, Phoenix Markets Exchange's futures division. Delighted to see the latest BGC competitor to the CME group has launched with LCH Clearing. All the best to the new venture, as clearly Howard Lutnick hopes to break the CME dollar silo this time around. In fact, I was discussing the FMX launch just yesterday on FinTech TV. You can catch me next Monday in the same slot, 9:20 Eastern, just before the opening bell every Monday. So, ladies and gentlemen, we today are rejoining the fabulous topic of space, the final frontier, probably the most exciting thing in finance we can imagine. And of course, as you may know, ladies and gentlemen, we've been big supporters of it here. We were supporters of the London Space Finance Initiative. April 25th, they had a mega event, which also, in fact, our social media agency sister company, One It Digital, was supporting very, very strongly. And indeed, previously, Mark Weekly was talking about from the city of London, and that is to space in IPO-VID 117. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking to find value in the new space economy. That's the title of a gripping book. I cannot recommend it to you highly enough, ladies and gentlemen. The only problem is you're going to have to wait a few weeks in order to manage to read it. But here's the good news. For the course of the next hour, we're going to be chatting with the author, Dr. Armen Papazian. Director and co-founder of the Space Value Foundation, Dr. Armen V. Papazian is a financial economist and author of two groundbreaking books on sustainable finance, The Space Value of Money, and Hardwiring Sustainability into Financial Mathematics. Armen is a former investment banker, stock exchange executive, lecturer, and consultant. And it's a joy to welcome you today. Armen, welcome to IPO-VID. Where in the world are you today?
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for having me. I'm in the United Kingdom and enjoying the weather.
Enjoying the weather? Well, that's a very interesting concept. You mean it's not raining, or you just like rain?
Well, I've gotten used to it, I have to say. But yes, it's a lovely day today. Thank you.
And so,
thanks for having me.
You're very, very welcome. Great to see you on the show. Fabulous name, Papazian. I must admit, every time I see a sound, wonderful Armenian family name like that, I'm instantly taken back to the wonders of Armenian brandy, Churchill's favourite tipple, sent to him every year. What was it? He used to get 100 bottles a year from Stalin. I don't think he got through all 100 bottles of it during the course of the last 20 years of his life, but certainly it didn't cause him in any way to shorten his lifespan. So tell us a little bit. I mean, how did you come to be here, be in the UK, and what's your background, Armen?
I've got to say, you caught it right. I do have an Armenian family name, but I was actually born in the Paris of the Middle East. And then since then, I've lived So I've studied in Canada, in the UK. I did my doctorate in the King's College, Cambridge. Then worked in Dubai for a few years at NAS. I had my brief, not brief, but the few years I spent in the stock exchange environment were at Nasdaq Dubai. Then I moved into investment banking. Then I moved to the US. I got involved in a project that had to do with the renovation project of Hangar 1 in NASA Research Park. Then I moved back to the UK to start to write books. It's my third one that's just about to come out in November. And also because I love, I was literally made at King's College, Cambridge. My mind and my worldview has been shaped here, so I very much feel at home. So,
how fabulous! What an incredible journey all the way from Beirut. And I'm presuming you must have been born in Beirut at the most wonderfully, interesting time, probably just before, unfortunately, things went downhill very, very badly for that magnificent city. Such a tragedy to see the way that Lebanon has not proceeded over the course of time, because it's genuinely such an incredible melting pot. So sad to see.
Absolutely.
Cambridge.
Absolutely.
Well, what do you get up to in Cambridge then? I mean, very interesting. You've got the stock exchange background we'll talk about in a moment. What are you up to in Cambridge? How did you manage to get into space and the space economy?
Well, I have to say that space has been a fascination of mine. And interestingly, I know it is kind of disconnected, but it's actually not. But my fascination with space began in Beirut, interestingly. Because I was a child when the interesting times began, and for me, space and the stars and the expanding horizons have been a personal passion of mine. And we are always in space, even if we don't allow our minds to take conscious awareness of it. Right now, we are in that galactic context, in the reality of a much wider universe. We usually shut out a lot of these contextual realities when we speak about stock exchanges or other realities in our economies, but ultimately we are always in that context, whether conscious of it or not. So that's my fascination, really.
Really, really interesting. And yes, as you say, I mean, we are all in many ways contextualized by space, as I speak to you today from Grand Turk, where I'm only 75 miles away from where the original Friendship 7 landed all that way back in 1962. So yes, space is all around us and all above us. So explain to me, how did you get, I mean, you talk about this, you were working on Hangar 1. Just explain to anybody who doesn't know about it, the history of NASA Hangar 1, please.
Hangar 1 is the hangar that used to host the hydrogen planes that a while back, the Zeppelin planes, and it was abandoned for many decades because of its structure and its and then at some point in 2012, a group of partners, including the small boutique consulting firm that I had founded, we got together and made a proposal to NASA Ames to transform Hangar 1 into an international space development hub. And it was fascinating. I was at NASA Research Park presenting the concept. We had a few adverts in USA Today. Eventually, NASA did issue an RFP for the hangar, but Google won the RFP. So we didn't actually get to enjoy the fruits of what we had instigated back then. But we were very much part of transforming and coming up with concepts of reusing that big hangar up in NASA Research Park. So
quite incredible. I mean, yes, the sheer amount of space that was required to park a Zeppelin must be quite something in terms of size and scale. So that obviously got you sort of blooded in working in the direct space limelight. Tell us a little bit about how you got to the exciting concept of writing about sustainability, the space economy, and now your latest book.
Well, I had the main insight that pretty much the last 14 years, 15 years of my intellectual kind of life, or the activity in my mind, so to speak. I have not been able to do anything else after that main insight. And that main insight is very simple. It's basically the realization that the entire finance discipline is actually, and the entire analytical framework upon which finance is built, and then also the instruments that we engineer, that we issue, that we buy and sell on stock exchanges, and so on and so forth, whether there be debt instruments or equity instruments, they're all conceptualized and valued in an analytical framework that's built entirely on two principles. One is risk and return, and the other one is time value of money. So basically, the entire analytical universe of the field of finance, in theory and in practice, is built on risk and time. There is no space. Space as our physical context is absent in our analytical framework. And therefore, we're also missing a principle in finance, which I have called the space value of money. And I have subsequently offered equations, how we can conceptualize the space value of money, how we can measure it, and how we can incorporate them into our equations, and therefore subsequently in our markets. So, and fundamentally, that concept, the space value of money concept, is the principle that is still missing, but it is the principle that establishes responsibility for impact on space. So that's the fundamental insight that dragged me into this adventure for the last 15 years.
Well, no, that's really, really fascinating. So traditionally, we would talk about the cash markets, bonds, stocks, and so on, as being two-dimensional. And we talk to the futures markets as being, the three-dimensional things. But suddenly it seems like you're really talking about a three-dimensional money discussion here.
Absolutely. Multidimensional in a sense, because, I mean, look, we are in space. We are at this very moment. The planet is in rotation, is in revolution around the sun. We are in a galactic context, whether we would like it or not, whether it is convenient for us or not. But not just from an outer space perspective. Your question is actually so on point, because the way I introduce space and the space value of money, the space isn't just outer space beyond the atmosphere of the planet. Space in the context of the space value of money stretches from subatomic space to interstellar space and every layer in between and beyond. So it's our physical context from the microcosm to the macrocosm. So in that sense, it's not just about outer space and everything that's beyond our atmosphere. It's because obviously we are in space already on this planet at this moment. We're talking to each other through probably through wireless, but also fiber optic cables under the ocean. But literally, it's the same context that stretches from the subatomic reality, the nano level of our material existence, to the macro level of planets and the sun and solar system and so on.
Wow. Now, that's quite a lot to unpack, and we're not even 15 minutes into the show so far. So let's try and talk about this a little bit and understand better how space comes into the equation and ultimately what that means for people who are looking at investment and finance and so on. And try to walk us through perhaps a little bit of the understanding of what that really means in terms of your value equation, please.
Okay. Because our equations, I mean, there are a few slides that of the graphs that we had that I've shared to demonstrate some of the figures on the space economy. But later on, once we've covered some of those, I would like to show one of the chart where I share the entire corpus of equations that are used, not to discuss on the show, of course, but just to contextualize the reality that we're facing with our equations in finance. Whether we're talking about bond equations, whether we're talking about cash flow equations, equity valuation equations, option valuation equations, asset valuation, all of them are built entirely using parameters that measure risk and time value of the cash flows or the assets. So the entire equations, the entire corpus of equations that we've got, they only use risk and time parameters to assess value and return. Now, obviously, anyone who's invested anything in all of the markets we've all worked in knows that these equations aren't applied in isolation, right? But they are actually used as guidelines. That's how investors gauge other investors' approach and opinion and valuations. Different brokers publish different estimates and projections, right? That entire analytical reality is purely based on risk and time parameters. There is no contextual parameter involved in those equations. And that's why, and this is something that I discuss in the first two books, as well as the one that's upcoming in November, that the reason we are facing the types of challenges we're facing today around the world, from sustainability, whether it's the carbon in the air or the plastic in the ocean, the sewage in the river, or the nanotoxins, or the plastic in the food chain, and so on, or the debris in orbit. All of this manifestation, we have created a human productivity that is absolutely oblivious to what it leaves behind. The plastic in the ocean, the carbon in the air, the sewage in the river, the debris in orbit, and so on and so forth. I can give you examples on chemical waste, industrial waste, and so on. The trend is obvious. We don't actually take responsibility of our impact on space and its many layers, right? The impact on the hydrosphere, on the exosphere, on the datasphere, and so on and so forth. And that's where it links. The space value of money is necessary because it establishes our responsibility for space impact, which addresses not just our ability to invest and expand in outer space. It also addresses our inability to create a sustainable and fair reality on this planet. Which has reached levels of urgency, and also, by the way, which is not yet addressed by any of the sustainability standards or the ESG hogwash we're facing today, pretending to actually achieve sustainability while not really addressing the multidimensional aspect or the source of the trouble, which is that our financial mathematics, our financial frameworks do not consider space, our physical reality, as a parameter. And unless we change that, unless we fundamentally expand our analytical framework, our core principles, and transform our equations across the board, it doesn't matter how many standards and bureaucratic regulatory reporting requirements we inflict on industry. We're still not going to become sustainable, and we're still not going to fix the planet. And that's why I believe also exchanges have a huge role to play in this debate. Right now, everyone's going with the flow with climate change and ESG because they feel a sense of societal anxiety about the subject, which is true. It's necessary, but we also need the proper frameworks and the proper transformations. We don't want to embark on a set of reporting standards that don't actually achieve sustainability, but they can create a host of other challenges for business and industry. So this is on the sustainability side.
Gosh, I have to say, I think you would have been the most interesting speaker at UN Climate Week this week, although you might have upended everybody's perspective on what's going on, Armen. It's a fascinating study altogether and very, very interesting and perspicacious. So let's talk about the actual, your new book. You're finding value in the space economy. I can see where you've got the understanding of the ESG elements and all of the, effectively, the impacts of what we're doing to space over time. And therefore, it's more than just purely restitution. It's also the delinquent value, the time decay, if you want, for better of a term, of what you lose because something is polluted or something has plastic or whatever. And therefore, we talk a lot about sort of almost, I would call it a half-life rather than nuclear fission and so on, or fusion when it's dying out. How do we ultimately move forward? How are you finding value in the space economy? And describe to us a little bit about your book. And indeed, let's have a look at that lovely cover, which I do believe Fernando has got ready to show us. Tell us.
Brilliant. Well, basically, the book is called Financing the Race to Space: How to Value, Invest, and Explore the Universe. It's a book that addresses it basically aims to deliver the tools, the concepts, and the equations that we need to be able to achieve two things, which I discussed earlier on. One is to invest and create a sustainable reality on Earth. And the second one is to invest and expand in outer space. In both of these aspects of our human civilization at the moment, we're failing miserably. We are at the moment unable to create a sustainable and fair reality on Earth, and we are not really investing properly to expand our reach in outer space. And that's what the book addresses mainly. Alongside all those solutions, I also cover and analyze the current reality of the outer space economy, some of the unique features, interesting facts, and also ultimately some very detailed discussions that offer solutions to the US national debt subject challenge, and the UK underinvestment and austerity challenge, which has been an issue that has plagued the UK for the last 14, 15 years. So I go from the macro solutions to the very practical examples.
So, and I hope it's not a spoiler alert, but ladies and gentlemen, just in case you're wondering, the solution to the US national debt is not actually selling a huge number of treasury bonds to the Martians, although I'm sure that's something that probably the Biden-Harris administration have thought of previously. Well, so if we look at this, we're breaking it down. I'm sorry to be facetious there, Armen, but it is a very interesting point how you relate this all together. So if we talk about, very specifically the space economy, one thing I noticed, and I think you've got a slide related to this, actually is, satellites. If we just talk about that for starters, it's fascinating to see how many of these little blighters are going into the air, and indeed largely because private enterprises are finally throwing them into the air. I saw a beautiful photograph yesterday on that international authority Instagram, and they were showing Elon Musk looking at his satellite that had just imploded barely 20 years ago, and it was his very, very first one in 2004, 2005, something like that, which did not end well. It literally ended up in a dustpan. And then looking at last week, where he had a man in his spacesuit from his space cruiser doing a spacewalk, which is quite incredible. So walk us through this. We're seeing an incredible growth. It's like the 15th century voyages of exploration almost of the Dutch and the Spanish Empire, and then subsequently the British and many others. What's going on with space launches?
Yes, you're spot on. And also it's a very exciting period, no doubt. But we have to understand what is exciting, exactly what's going on from a process perspective, right? And if we can show the slide that the next one, right after this one, the next slide, I prepared actually this summarizes the orbital launches in Q1 and Q2 2024. In fact, it's incredible because 2024 is one of the record years in terms of January 2024 was a record month, and Space Foundation described it as the busiest start to a year since the space age dawned in 1957. So something is happening, and we've had a few launches throughout the first two quarters. And if you notice, the chart in front of you depicts the orbital launches by country as well as the total. There are four permanent almost countries that are accessing space on a regular basis. I'm talking specifically about Q1 and Q2 2024, and that's US, China, Russia, and India. Everyone else is in one quarter, but not the other at the moment. But if you can move to the next slide, what you see is quite interesting as to those are the numbers that you saw earlier on were the number of orbital launches. But how about the number of spacecraft being launched? And who are the providers? Now, that's where you see something very unique. First of all, SpaceX is leading the entire planet. So you mentioning Elon is absolutely correct. And then you can see that the difference is, it's beyond significant. In Q1 2024, SpaceX launched 525 spacecraft, while the second highest was China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation at 27. Similar for Q2, we had for the Q2 we had 648 SpaceX, and as you can see, the numbers are again SpaceX is far beyond everyone else. They're actually launching Starlink satellites, most of them. But to sum up as to what is being sent up, right? In Q2, as you can see, and Q1 at the bottom in the two rectangles at the bottom, from the 797 spacecraft launched in Q2 2024, 92 were commercial companies, obviously, and then 67 were communication spacecraft. Now, so you're again correct in focusing on satellites, but let's move to the next slide and let me show you as to what the main themes are. Satellites aren't the only theme, so they're very important and they dominate the most of the spacecraft being launched into outer space. But the main themes, as per Morgan Stanley, are five. So first is the link between space and climate change. So immediately you can think of Earth observation and so on and so forth. Increased capital formation in the space economy. Mitigating orbital debris is another theme. Space and security is another. And then, of course, telecoms. But notice something. On the website of SpaceX, SpaceX declares making life multiplanetary as one of its main missions. And yet, when you look at the economy of outer space, as per Morgan Stanley, and now I'll show you in the next slide as well, making life multiplanetary, space exploration aren't really dominant themes in this space economy. Now, the most important, well, not the most important, but one of the most recent publications that made quite a lot of noise was done in April 2024 by the World Economic Forum and McKinsey and Company. They estimated that the space economy stood at $630 billion in 2023, and it is estimated that it will reach 1.8 trillion, basically, nearly. Now, growth projected is 9% per year. But interestingly, check on the right side of the slide, I've compared this 630 billion outer space economy figure with two very basic measures. First, world GDP in 2023. Now, this 630 billion space economy, basically, it is around almost 0.6% of world GDP in 2023. So it's still very much tiny. But if we compare that same economy to global wealth, we're talking about 0.13%. So as much as the buzz is growing around the space economy, first, it's not about space exploration as per the economy. And second, that space economy is still very much tiny compared to world GDP and world global wealth. Now, if you move to the next slide, let me give you another layer of comparison so you contextualize the space economy for the viewers and the watchers, whoever listens to tomorrow. At 630 billion, the global outer space economy or space economy, this is how it compares to a few other important figures. In 2023, global military expenditure was more than 2.3 trillion or 2,393 billion, right? I mean, that's 2.3% of world GDP. So another important fact that we should note about this outer space economy is that, well, the species, humanity, spends a lot more on defending itself from itself rather than building its collective future in outer space. This is one. If we zoom out again and look on the right side, in 2023, global advertising spending in billions was 1,012, so around $1 trillion. Again, bigger than the outer space economy at 630 billion. So another important fact about this space economy, global space economy, the species, humanity, spends more on trying to sell goods and services to itself than on building its own collective future in outer space. In fact, this 630 billion space economy, despite all the buzz and all the investment banks and consulting firms publishing reports left, right, and center, it's actually smaller than the revenues of the largest Chinese and largest American oil and gas companies in terms of revenues in 2023. ExxonMobil and Sinopec actually made more than the entire space economy at 686 billion. This for you to visualize and contextualize and be able to dissect the nature of the enthusiasm around the space economy. If we can go to the next slide. Now, but what's in this economy? Now, there's a lot of numbers and they're tiny, I know, but you don't have to worry about it. I'm going to focus on a few important elements only. Based again on the World Economic Forum and McKinsey report, in 2023, from that 630 billion space economy, 61.4% are in industries that have nothing to do with outer space, really. Supply chain and transportation, food and beverage, media, and so that's interesting, right? We're talking about a space economy where 61.4% is actually nothing to do with the actual sector as such. Now, if you look on the right side, this is another breakdown of the same economy between, this is actually, I've recreated this based on a very over-designed table in the report. This is much simpler than what it's actually in the report. But in 2023, based on the kinds of applications in this same industry, you notice that the space exploration title has only 15 billion associated to it, which it basically represents 2.4%. Now, of course, there are many aspects here which are very relevant to exploration, like ground hardware operations, launch platforms, and so on. But in terms of the vision, the fact that space exploration itself is a 2.4% of whatever this outer space economy is. And lastly, communications and PNT, which PNT stands for positioning, navigation, and timing, basically they account for 70.3% of the entire outer space economy in terms of applications, not industry, right? Now, why is this possible? Well, because this approach to how we measure the space economy is not just the McKinsey report, it's also basically from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, where the space sector is defined and measured as basically space-related goods and services, public and or private, which are used in space or directly support those used in space, and the definitions at the bottom, require direct input from space to function or directly support those that do, and are associated with studying space. But we understand that, but isn't it interesting that require direct input from space to function, somehow this entire analysis of the space economy leaves out solar power. Solar power is not included in this measurement of the space economy. But the sun is in space, right? So require direct input from space to function is a very technological statement when measuring the space economy, which I think is not necessarily right or wrong. I'm just trying to help the viewers understand the basics and the mechanics of this measurement. That the sun, which is in space, and solar power on Earth, which depends on that entity in space, the sun, is not accounted for. But Uber is, based on McKinsey and World Economic Forum, because food and beverage and transportation and consumer goods and so on and so forth are included. So that's a very unique point to consider in terms of the economy. Now, the last slide, the next slide is the last one I would like to show, and then we can go back to our discussion, Patrick, and maybe sum it up. The next aspect here that we must consider to understand the outer space economy, or the space economy, is that the public side, so in other words, the governmental side, this is a slightly different measurement of the public expenditure on outer space development programs and agencies by Euroconsult, was 117 billion in 2023. Now, 63% of that 117 billion of global public governmental expenditure on outer space was done in the US, putting together the NASA budget, the US Space Force budget, and the intelligence budget. Now that's immense, right? So the US is the major player without question. But look at the NASA budget over the last 60 or so years. Look at and this is inflation adjusted, the stagnation that it has gone through and the budget cuts it has had to go through over the last few years as well is evident. Again, between 23 and 24, it had the budget cut due to spending cuts and so on. Similarly, even though a bit later, the US Space Force budget was also reduced for 2025, although small amount, but still. Now, there are two things that are important to recognize here. The public space expenditure is being militarized on the one hand, so there is a big role that is being allocated to the militarization of space. And the second aspect that defines public expenditure is that it is at the mercy of government budgets, government debts, and so spending cuts. So ultimately, though, that's the broader some of the key features. Of course, there's a lot more to talk about. There's tons more in the book as well, but I'm very conscious of the time constraints we have here. But that's pretty much the, so to speak, key aspects of that economy to understand it more.
Fascinating altogether. Thank you very much, Armen. So we're at an intriguing juncture. I want to get back to the sort of the fear and greed of the space economy in just a minute, allied to space. Let's also talk about a couple of things, ladies and gentlemen, just to give you a break for a moment, Armen, so you can manage to get yourself a drink after that fascinating discussion from everything from the primacy of private sector space launches through to what's been happening in the space economy recently, and indeed the militarization of government spending, which is quite intriguing. Let's talk, ladies and gentlemen, about a couple of things we do every week at this sort of time. We've got our books of the week. We're catching up with our final book from summer, and then we're also going to be looking at this week's book of the week. Of course, these books of the week are previewed in the EI Weekend. That's our free macro read. You are more than welcome to subscribe to that absolutely free of charge at exchangeinvest.com. We cover the space economy and that on occasion, AI and multiple other fascinating topics over the course of time. Here's one from one of our readers, actually, of EI Weekend, Jim Rogers, Adventure Capitalist. That was our book of the week last week. Really thrilling read this. Of course, we some months ago gave you Investment Biker, which is also the original story of how Jim went around the world on a fascinating Harley Davidson, or was it BMW? I think it was BMW motorbike, actually, to be quite correct. This time around, he again chose some fascinating German hardware. This was a super modified Mercedes in a magnificent sunburst orange. Adventure Capitalist is the story of a brilliant investing mind going around the world and what he learned about all of the different fascinating and intriguing economies, nations, peoples of the earth. Without so much as a look towards space, he was firmly planted on the ground and across the seas at all points in time. Still a great read, ladies and gentlemen, 20 years on from its publication. Thoroughly recommend it, from the most intriguing raconteur, Jim Rogers. Now, speaking of, actually, this week's book of the week comes from someone who used to work in the same office. Actually, they used to work together, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Soros. George Soros' Soros on Soros is a slightly different book. It's a much more reflective tone. It's Soros talking about his own investing approach, philosophy, politics, much more. This was published about 25 years ago, but nonetheless is a really interesting and incisive read into one of the great trading minds of the late 20th into 21st century. He was in conversation with the late great investment analyst Byron Vine. So those are our books of the week. We're caught up again. The next book of the week will be previewed on Saturday's EI Weekend. Don't forget, if you're looking at what's going on in the world of exchanges daily, the bulletin of bourses in every possible dimension that we can find for exchanges, you can find us at exchangeinvest.com. Sign up. We'll have lots more information coming this week. And of course, looking at tomorrow's edition already, what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about those antitrust raids on Deutsche Börse and NASDAQ, as well as the launch of FMX, the Phoenix Market Exchange, which went live last night at, about 2100 Eastern Time, and has now had pretty much its first trading day as we speak at this juncture. So, returning to the wonderful world. Actually, no, first of all, let's have something a little bit different, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go to those emerging markets. We have had a regular appearance over time from one of our most fantastic guests. He's a man who I think in many ways needs no introduction, but I do believe we've got one of his videos talking about the lure of, well, he was talking to us several weeks ago about the lure of Vietnamese and Polish economies when he was last on this show. Let's jump to that video if we can and look at a brief insert talking about the lure of the base of economy and economic growth.
Capitalism is much more important for poor people, for the weak, because strong people, they come along in almost every system. But for people living in poverty, capitalism is the only hope. Two countries, Poland and Vietnam. Both countries have a lot in common. First, they were victims of terrible wars. In Poland, more people were killed in the Second World War than in any other country, of course, as a percentage of the population. And Vietnam, they were in war with almost everyone. After the war, the socialist planned economy was established in both countries, in Vietnam and in Poland. And now, since 3 decades, Poland is definitely Europe's growth champion, and Vietnam is one of the fastest growing countries.
the incredible Dr. Rainer Zittelmann there. You can catch his IPO vids wherever you're watching this show. Just search for IPO-VID. All of them are archived online on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Fascinating stories they make, each and every one of them. Now, in our discussion today about space, we've had a couple of fascinating interventions with our guest, Dr. Armen Papazian, talking about finding value in the new space economy, which is the title also of his latest book that's coming out in November. Very, very interesting insight here. With increased investment in a thriving startup ecosystem, London is paving the way for groundbreaking advancements in space technology with Mark Wheatley and his London Space Finance Initiative. Truly exciting times. Thank you very much for that intervention. And of course, you can catch that show, number 117, as I mentioned earlier, where we first introduced the whole concept of the space economy on IPO-VID. And indeed, Bata Young has a magnificent comment here. It's really, really interesting. Dovetails beautifully with what you were saying about the overall size of the space economy and how so much of it, 65% of it or something, is basically being accounted for by very, very terrestrial businesses that have no interest in space. To send a person to the moon, nearly 500,000 individuals worked on the Apollo missions. A little less than 10% of these people worked directly for NASA, while the rest were a large group of suppliers, contractors, and subcontractors, all working together to achieve a common goal. So it's a fascinating number and a fascinating multiplier effect we get from the economy, Dr. Armen. One of the things I'm thinking about right here is, which intrigues me, is that we have, and I'm sorry, I think I might have actually misattributed that. Was that a comment from Richard Leung? I'm not sure. Oh no, Dr. Richard Leung is saying thanks to Dr. Papazian for sharing his learning, for his sharing. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard. It is a joy to have an expert in space finance who's got such a fantastically capacious mind. His own space value of how much he's managing to get into that remarkably reasonably sized cranium is quite incredible. That's a whole further topic for discussion in the future, I'm sure. One thing struck me. When you're going through all of these figures, you're talking about what's going on. You talk about the militarization of the economy by government and so on. It strikes me that a great deal of what we see as the space economy so far, and certainly the exploration of space, has been fueled by the first of the two great motivations of investment: fear. I mean, the Americans got into space because the Russians were going into space. The Russians were in space because the Americans were going into space. Ultimately, the Russians got their man in space first. The Americans got their men on the moon first. And the whole thing sort of fell apart, actually, during the 1970s due to various economic impacts as communism started to crumble. And indeed, the US had the oil crisis. And therefore, it became less exciting because Mars was just too far away. And it took us another 40 years before we get to this interesting new set of the private investors. What I'm wondering about is, you talk a lot about how there's no real sort of space exploratory economy happening in any significant sense. I'm wondering, in the Middle Ages or after the Middle Ages, when we got the first voyages of discovery, that was really fundamentally driven by, let's face it, greed. It was the opportunity to find new spices, new ways to trade. It was the opportunity to actually gain whole new territories. Do you think that there is some sort of a trigger, a switch that's going to suddenly push for a greater interest in space exploration as a component of the space economy in the near future? And what do you think that might be, Armen?
Well, brilliant question, actually, because I'm going to answer your last question, because I think you asked two, but the last one: what would be the trigger of a transformed human civilization? I discussed this in the book. In the current reality, that if we were to describe our current civilizational level, right? I'm not talking about countries and their own logic and their own reasons for doing things, but on a planetary level, on a species level, we are at the moment ruining the oceans, outer exosphere. We're the atmosphere. We're literally, that's one. So we are literally littering space, and it doesn't matter how far we talk about fixing it. We're not yet fixing it. ESG does not fix this mess, and anyone who pretends that it does is interested in the sustainability of something else, not the species in space. That's a very different challenge. Now, what would it take us to cross to trigger authentic exploratory adventure or investment in outer space. Many things. The transformation in our financial framework, as I discussed, is key, because we will never be able to invest what we need to invest to actually go and establish on Mars and Moon and maintain these habitats and educate their workforces. And NASA's budget is being cut from year on year because of this, because of that. Elon Musk tweeted 2 days ago that the only way to fund, because he's funding our future in outer space through Starlink internet, and he's promoting people to buy Starlink internet so we can go to Mars. I mean, seriously, remember the numbers we were talking about. If we're going to finance an expansion in outer space, we need fundamental transformations in our value framework, in our mathematics, and in our monetary architecture. Those are the key propositions of the book. But what will trigger a wider humanity-wide transformation? Purely, I would say, we need, once the number of those humans who interpret and understand their own life and their own reality at this very moment on this planet, not as a map-based reality or a book-based reality. And I'm referring to specifically two aspects of human interpretation which seem to be plaguing us in our current reality today. Too many of us interpret the universe based on where they are on a map. This is not a map. It's a planet in a galaxy, in a universe. And these are not imaginary things which are irrational. They're actually far more real than the entire collection of our beliefs that we project onto life. That's one. So we need to have more of us that come to the realization that this isn't a map, it's a planet. And once we get to that critical mass, of course, linked with those fundamental transformations we need in our financial mathematics, in our monetary architecture, because if you remember some of the slides we couldn't manage to discuss, but if we discussed them, we can maybe do another session, another talk, another time. But without those changes, without those fundamental changes in our financial value framework, in our financial mathematics, and our monetary architecture, we will not be able to address our key challenges and our sustainability in space. That's my personal belief, and that's my argument in the book, and I offer for the solutions to that effect. So,
well, I think the conversation could carry on for several hours still. And yes, I look forward to carrying on the conversation in another episode. But for now, we're time limited for today, Dr. Armen. So I'm going to ask you that key question we ask at all points in time here. Where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Brilliant. Well, as you have said so many years ago in your book, and you've been arguing over the last few decades, the technology revolution has been with us already for some time. I think the true revolution that's next is not the technological aspect of markets and the execution of trades, right? But it's more about what kind of a value framework and what kind of equations we use in that support that trading. And this is where I'm going to come back to my main proposition and say the next capital market revolution is when a space-adjusted mathematics becomes the foundational element of trading and also the instrument design and engineering, because believe me, to explore space, to be able to expand into outer space, we cannot go out there with our teeny tiny mathematics measuring value and cash flows based purely on risk and time. in the grand context of the universe, those equations will not take us very far. So that's where I see the next capital market revolution, the type of market where the engineered products, going far beyond technology as such, is where the main structure and the engineered products facilitate investments and expansion in outer space that may take decades and is necessary to expand and achieve and conquer very large distances in the solar system.
Gosh, it feels like we've constructed ourselves across vast solar system kind of dimensions and distances today in the course of just under 1 hour. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Armen Papazian. Finding Value in the New Space Economy.
My pleasure.
Your new book is going to be out in November. Really looking forward to that being published. I've had the joy of being able to read a pre-publication copy. It is gripping, ladies and gentlemen. So much in there that it's really, really worth reading, even if you're not oriented towards the space economy. Thank you very, very much for your time, Dr. Armen. Thank you to those who corresponded with us today. Richard Leong, to Beate Young as well for her input. And let me just say that coming next week, we're going to have a fabulous show. We're looking forward to discussing in IPO-VID 154, Prometheum, blockchains, markets and the future of finance with the man at the forefront of regulated digital asset trading, Aaron Kaplan. Can't wait for that on the 1st of October. That's going to be same time, same place next week at midday Eastern. In the meantime, if you can't get enough of us, I will tell you we've got a very, very exciting show coming up very, very briefly tomorrow, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, European time, 8 a.m. Eastern time. We're going to be discussing, well, it's all related to a different book, The Exchange Manifesto. We're going to be talking with the good folks of the AFM, including the chairman and president of the AFM, Pat Kenny and Chris Sturgis, both themselves IPO-VID alumni, and also a third IPO-VID alumni, the Expiry boss. We're going to be looking at the whole value chain and what's going to be happening ahead of the AFM's Tech Day, of which Exchange Invest is proud to be amongst the cadre of sponsors. Join us for that tomorrow morning at 100 hours if you can. See us next Tuesday for the big world wonderment of talking to Aaron Kaplan about what's been going on in the world of regulated blockchains and the future of finance in that aspect. Catch us every day at exchangeinvest.com for everything about the future markets. It only remains for me to say thank you very, very much to our production team today. Thank you to Fernando, Jamil and Marianne for a seamless show with all of those many fascinating slides. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Armen, for your presentation. My name is Patrick L. Young. I wish you all a great week in life and markets, ladies and gentlemen. Catch up next week. Thanks again for watching this, Finding Value in the Space Economy.